Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. My name is Flavia Maximo. I'm a labor law professor at the Federal University of Ouro, Preto in Brazil, and I'm also in the core group of the Democratizing Work movement. I'm very honored to be here today with François Gemenne. Dr. Gemenne Hi. Dr. Gemenne is a specialist on environmental geopolitics and migration dynamics. He's a senior research associate at the University of Liège, where he's also the director of the Hugo Observatory, a research center committed to study the interactions between environmental changes, human migration, and politics. He has consulted for several organizations, including the International Organization of Migration, the World Bank, the ACP Observatory on Migration, and the British government. He has co-written several books, such as The Anthropocene and the Global Environmental Crisis, and An Atlas of Environmental Migration. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Dr. Gemenne.
Thanks for having me.
The pleasure, and for me personally, it's also an amazing opportunity to hear about your research, considering the fact that I'm Brazilian and our living reality today embraces all perspectives of environmental geopolitics related also to a colonial background. So thank you for being here with us. So you read the Democratizing Work manifesto.
Sure. And I read it at the time when it was published in the press, in the newspapers.
Oh, so you were one of the first ones.
Yeah, that was, when was it? That was at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, right? That was in the spring of 2020, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, on May 2020,
May.
Yes. And may I ask you, which aspect or principle of it resonates with your own work? Which principle relates to your own work?
Yes. Well, clearly, I do work on the human aspects of climate change, on the way climate change is transforming societies, both in the global south and in the global north. I work in particular on issues such as migration or peace and conflict, but also on the international negotiations and the balance of power between different countries on these issues. So you might expect me to say that the cluster of the manifesto that resonates the most with my work is the one related to the decarbonation. But as a matter of fact, I would like to pick the idea of democratizing. And I think that the issue of democracy, when it is about fighting climate change, is essential. Of course, it is also essential to decarbonize our economies. The decommodification is also essential. But I think that one of the blind spots of the fight against climate change is really the democratic challenges that it involves. We know pretty much what we have to do. We know pretty much the choices that we have to make if we want to respect the objectives of the Paris Agreement. But yet, despite our knowing them, it is as if we were unable to act and unable to transform this knowledge into action. And I think the reason why we fail to act is because our democracies remain unable to tackle climate change. And therefore, there is a huge democratic challenge in there. Our democracies remain unable to tackle long-term issues. And I think that clearly there is a mismatch between the timescale of climate change and the timescale of our democracies. And I think that we need to work in our democracies so that they can tackle long-term issues. But there is also, I think, a crisis of representation in our democracies. We need to ask ourselves the questions, who represents us? Most people, at least in the global north, know pretty much what they can do themselves as consumers to reduce their own carbon footprint. They know that they need to use more public transportation, they need to reduce their consumption of meat, they know that they need to fly less. All of that is known by most people in the global north. But these are actions that we can take as individual consumers. And we know that even if we were all of us living the lifestyle of Greta Thunberg, even in that scenario, which is unlikely as we speak, even in that scenario, we would curb global greenhouse gas by about 35 to 40%, which means that it is, of course, important, but it is not sufficient. And we know that the real choices we need to make to curb climate change are collective choices, meaning choices that we will make not as individual consumers, but choices that we will need to make collectively as citizens. Choices related to major investment decisions, for example, choices related to infrastructure, changes related and choices related to regulation or to fiscal policy. All of that are the choices that we will need to make together as citizens. And the problem right now is that most people have the impression that many of their preferences and aspirations are not represented in democratic institutions, which means that we have a lot of people who feel completely left out by democracy. We've had the crisis with the yellow vests in France, which says a lot about how people felt neglected, unrepresented in democratic institutions. But I also teach at Sciences Po, which is a kind of university for the French elite, or even for the international elite. And even though my students are probably amongst the most well-off segments of the population, despite that, many of these students do not vote because they consider that democracy does not represent them. And because they consider democratic institutions as a kind of theater, and they don't want to be part of that. That doesn't mean that they're not involved into politics. That doesn't mean that they're not aware of the major challenges of our time. It just means that they feel that democracy cannot represent them. And this is the reason why so many youth in so many countries do not vote anymore, because they don't feel represented. And I think there is a real challenge here in the issue of democratic representation. And if we don't feel that there can be an alignment of some individual choices that we're ready to make as consumers with the collective choices we need to make as citizens, we will never be able to tackle climate change. And this is true within each country, but this is also true in the international negotiations. We're represented in the international negotiations on climate change by our own national governments. And of course, each government is pursuing its own national interests. And therefore, we can see also the mismatch when we need to set up a system of global governance working for the common good of humanity on the basis of national interests. When I look at the negotiations on climate change, I'm not sure that I'm best represented by my national government, especially given that some governments are elected for the purpose of basically making international negotiations fail. This is why I often say that nationalism is probably a bigger foe to the climate than oil, gas, or coal even. Because the pursuit of national interest will not enable to tackle climate change. And this is the reason why we need to democratize the fight against climate change on a national basis, but also on an international basis in the international negotiations arenas. And this is the reason why we need to ask ourselves, who is our best representative?
Thank you for this amazing answer. Like, I feel that I'm not completely represented for my national negotiations or
And
international.
that's the case of many people.
Yeah, but like in my case, it's outrageous, right? And then
And you probably, I mean, without assuming your political preference, I would bet that you're probably better represented by the Brazilian indigenous people,
of course,
in the negotiations than by your national government. And yet the indigenous people don't really have a say in the negotiation.
no. And even if they participate on this negotiation, the question is, their voice would be heard, or will be just like a fake.
They wouldn't be on an equal footage, of course, with national government.
Yes. So thank you for this amazing response. I would like to ask you, like in the aspect of collective choices, because you mentioned like the difference between global South and global North. Like, what are the impacts of in these collective choices, like to keep on the democratizing principle? Do you think that when you assume a collective choices, these aspects in colonial backgrounds should be considered? Like, how can we manage these differences between global North and global South?
Yep. Clearly, the opposition between countries of the global North and of the global South is a key issue in the international negotiations. And rightly so, countries of the global South argue that they have a right to develop and ask for countries of the global North to do more, whereas countries of the global North ask countries of the global South not to increase their greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where we have a kind of collision of the principles of justice and fairness with efficiency. The real problem right now is that even if industrialized countries were to reduce significantly their greenhouse gas emissions, which they are not yet doing, even in that scenario, we know very well that if countries of the global South follow the same development path as their counterparts in the global North, we will not achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This is clearly a problem of efficiency, because out of fairness and of justice, you could argue, and rightly so, that countries of the global South have the right to develop and therefore have the right to use the fossil fuels that they have at their disposal, especially given that the development was hindered because of the colonization period. And of course, we will not redo history here, but this is important to take into account. And therefore, as a matter of justice, yes, of course, countries of the global South have that right to develop. This is the reason why we absolutely need to work with countries of the global South to make sure that their development does not rely on fossil fuels. Because we know very well that this will be detrimental for all if they follow the same development path as countries of the global North. But we are not in the position in industrialized countries to demand that from countries of the global South, which is the reason why I think we should not demand that to them, but work with them so that it is in their interest and in the interest of everyone. And right now, the problem really is that in the international negotiation, each country is focused on reducing its own greenhouse gas emissions. They would like to have the cleanest sheet as possible so that they would look good in the international negotiations. And as we speak, many countries of the global North are using technologies that rely on resources taken in the global South and which will make countries of the global South more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And this has to stop. And this is the reason why we should stop focusing only on our own greenhouse gas reduction, but on the global reduction of greenhouse gas. I mean, the climate doesn't care whether the emission come from the US, from Belgium, from Botswana, or South Korea. What matters is really the global emissions, and we do not take that sufficiently into account. We need to realize that the fight against climate change will be won or lost, not just in Brussels, in Washington, or in Tokyo, but also in Cairo, in Mexico, in Jakarta, and that the climate policies of these countries will determine whether or not we will be able to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, which means that we should not work only on the decarbonization of our own economies within our own borders, but we need to project our climate action beyond our borders and to work with countries of the global south so that we can see what kind of equitable solution there is to decarbonize globally and not on a national basis. And that's a huge challenge in the negotiations.
Yeah, now I understand completely why you choose the democratizing principle. So what are the main challenges today that stand in the way of fulfilling the aspirations of the manifesto, in your opinion?
I would say that a key challenge, and again in the field of climate change, is obviously the weight of lobbies. Industrial and financial lobbies continue to weigh heavily on the investments and on the choices that are made towards fossil fuels. In the aftermath of the pandemic, looking at the situation from a European viewpoint, we could have been under the impression that it was a kind of momentum or turning point for public investment, and clearly the EU is investing more into the green transition, and this is a good move, and we should salute it. But in many other countries, I mean, the economic plans after the pandemic were just reinvestment in fossil fuel energies. That was the case in Canada, that was the case in Australia, in India, in Brazil to a certain extent, and we need to be aware of that. So the weight of industrial and financial lobbies is huge. Then I would say that another key challenge, another key obstacle is the obstacle of empowerment. I am really struck by the fact that every time I give a talk to a public audience on climate change, there are people in the room who are telling me, sure, but what can we do about this? These are the decisions taken by our governments. And I'm like, what are you saying? I mean, you live in Europe. These are decisions taken by a government that you have elected. You cannot say that you cannot do anything about it because these are the decisions taken by your government. I mean, it's something that cannot be heard. And therefore, I think that the real challenge in the fight against climate change is a challenge of empowerment. People need to realize that they can have a say on the collective choices and decisions. People need to feel less isolated and realize the power that they have when they act collectively. And I think that this issue of empowerment, which is also about knowledge, of course, is an essential challenge if we want to democratize the fight against climate change. So that people no longer say, what can we do about it? These are decisions by the governments.
And from your perspective, do you think that are there any concrete opportunities for taking actionable steps in the near future to further the democratized principle or the carbonized principle?
As of now, we live in what historian Timothy Mitchell calls a carbon democracy. That is a democracy that relies on the exploitation of carbon, on the burning of carbon. Some concrete steps that could be taken by everyone is, for example, regarding their savings. Quite a lot of people have savings in the bank, and these banks continue to invest heavily in the fossil fuel industry. The IMF, which is not exactly Greenpeace or Fridays for Future, the International Monetary Fund reckons that every year, about 6% of the world's global GDP are invested in fossil fuels, either as private investment or as public subsidies. We, at least all of us who have savings in traditional banks, contribute to this investment in the fossil fuel energy. One of the major investors in fossil fuel energies are pension funds, meaning the financial institutions that are responsible for paying the pensions of a lot of workers across the world, which means that a lot of pensions or employment benefits are paid through investments in fossil fuels. And really, most people are completely unaware of that. And I think this is a collective challenge for those relying on pensions, employment benefits, and so on and so forth, that they ask their employers that this money should no longer come from investments in fossil fuels. This is also a challenge for students. You know, on the first class, this is a class on climate policies. And of course, most of the students are very aware of the climate challenge and are themselves doing a lot to try and reduce their own carbon footprint. But I tell them, look, if you really want to do something useful for the climate this year, you should stand up, exit the classroom, resign from the university, and ask for the reimbursement of your tuition fees. Because the tuition fees in most universities are invested in fossil fuels. And of course, the students are not always aware of that. And therefore, we need to realize the power of our money. And of course, no student has ever stood up, left the classroom, and asked for the reimbursement of tuition fees. But I'm glad to see that thanks to student mobilization, a lot of universities are now divesting from fossil fuels. And this is an absolutely essential step to take.
Wow.
So I wish that all workers' union would actually ask, companies, trade unions, pension funds to divest from fossil fuel energies.
And do you think that this solution will be also valid for the Global South?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, in emerging countries, certainly this is the case as well. In countries like Brazil or Turkey, Morocco, this is the case. No, for the poorest country, obviously, the issue is not so much the reduction of their greenhouse gas emissions. It's not so much the investments in fossil fuels. I think that for them, the issue is an issue of adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and also an issue of justice. In many occasions, their natural resources will be poached by industrialized countries, either to finance or to work towards the decarbonization of their economy, or sometimes directly fossil fuels that will be poached by industrialized countries. And I think that countries of the Global South need to resist this poaching, which is still a very colonial action. And also, countries of the Global South need to make sure that they receive the appropriate amount of funding for adaptation. And they should not consider this funding as development assistance. This is really the payment of a debt that the Global North owes to the Global South.
Thank you. Thank you for your amazing perspective. That is, your knowledge production is very situated in terms of geopolitics and body politics of knowledge. And I appreciate that, being a researcher on the Global South. So do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
I just want to say that large gatherings like the one that you're organizing is really essential. And I think that what is killing us sometimes is the feeling that we're isolated and alone. And I think that it's a huge issue of empowerment to realize what we can do together, to realize that our opinions, that our voices are also shared across the world. And I think this is really important. And I'm really hoping that in the coming months or years, we can also organize real gatherings so that people can really feel empowered. This is a huge challenge also for climate change, not just for the workplace. And both are related, of course.
It's true. I think you're totally right. Like this feeling of belonging to something that is
This is one of the biggest threats to democracy.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why populist movements are so popular.
Yes, I think in this movement, we in certain ways were able to create this sparkle of belonging to something in one of the most dramatic moments of our history. So thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Gemenne. And it was wonderful having you here on the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. Your research is an inspiration for our movement, and thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. I wish you and everyone listening all the best.
Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you. Bye-bye.